Jeremy
Eight
went
four
dark.
four 552.
Um,
Okay, that's it.
okay. Oh, there he is. Hello. I think we're live. I'm joined today, as usual, with Stephanie Boudet and Jeremy in Japan. Um,
Yay.
yeah. So there's been a few technical glitches here and there, but don't be surprised to the viewing audience if someone disappears. Hopefully, they will reappear. Um, so, Jeremy, how are you doing? You're in Japan. Very
I
early in the
am.
morning. Yeah.
It is 4 o'clock in the morning here, but that's 1 in the afternoon there, so it still feels normal.
Okay. Yeah. It's noon here. You're on a different time zone, so yeah,
Okay, there you go then.
it would be one where you are normally. Stephanie, how are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Yes.
I'm ready to debate.
Yeah, you are
Well,
not in
maybe not
Japan.
debate. I am not in Japan. No.
Yeah. Well, our topic was American Apocalypse 2.0. I think we did one originally called American Apocalypse. I don't quite recall.
Hmm.
If we did, it's been a while back. But clearly, this is going to be about current affairs and what's going on right now in the United States. And this is kind of no holds barred. We're not going to sugarcoat things, and we're certainly none of us are pro MAGA. So we're just for anyone watching, you know, that's where we're coming from. What we thought that we would do is look at what's going on from really kind of two major perspectives. The third one is going to be MAGA and how these other two primary perspectives sort of influence what's going on right now. And this is Christian nationalism. And then on the other hand, there is I don't know. We call it. I've been just referring to it as the Dark Enlightenment. Steph had a really good term of a techno theocratic kind of government, but it is both of these things are kind of informing MAGA, and I don't want to
Mhm.
suggest that everyone who is in MAGA is a Christian nationalist or part of these, tech bro sort of scenario. But it's been kind of caught up within these two ideas. So I thought we'd start with Christian nationalism. And there's a lot. So if we're struggling to try to find our way, it's because a lot of this information is so overwhelming. Um, and we'll probably end up doing some deeper dives later on. But this is us just, like stepping our toes into the rabbit hole instead of rather just going in head first, um, because there's a lot. Um,
Hmm.
so I thought that we would start with Christian nationalism. I think that one is probably the easiest one to do. And I think a really clear definition of Christian nationalism is, as it applies to the United States, is the idea that the United States is a Christian nation and that it ought to be ruled by biblical laws.
And
Does
those laws don't necessarily conform to Jesus' teachings.
Yes, that's something that is really important that I wanted to mention later, but that Christian
Okay.
nationalism is kind of a perversion of the teachings of Jesus. So you're absolutely 100% right that this is not conforming to um, Christian values necessarily. Um, Christian nationalism really seems to be not really about the values anyway. It seems to be
Hmm.
more in alignment with power.
Right.
Um,
Mhm.
but I thought that maybe the first place to begin with Christian nationalism is maybe a little bit of history,
Hmm.
in the sense that the United States was not founded as a Christian nation. That is simply not true that this was a Christian nation. It is not true that the Ten Commandments, that our laws are based on the Ten Commandments. And just a quick look at them demonstrates that. You know, you can covet your neighbor's wife all you want, and that's not against the law. You know, the only...
More important there is, though, coveting thy neighbor's goods, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. That's we're not supposed to do that yet. We're kind of founded on that, you know?
Yep.
Yeah, to some extent, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think it's just to kind of go back to the history, because people will say, but it's the Pilgrims and the Puritans, right? They weren't the first people in this nation. The first people in this nation were colonists, and these were corporate entities that wanted the nation for its natural resources. It was a corporate enterprise before it was a place of religious freedom. And I think it's also important to note that these small communities of the Puritans and the Pilgrims who came over here were running away from religious persecution.
Right.
And they did set up like little theocracies, but those failed. They completely failed. And I think that probably the watermark for that was what happened at Salem, because you had what happened in Salem, and my family was directly involved. Kind of led to the end of Puritanism in the United States, because you then got that sort of transitional character of Jonathan Edwards. And that right there is sort of the birth of American evangelicalism rather than the Puritanism. Now, I think, though, something that's important is you can't divorce Christianity from the founding of the nation for a number of reasons. One is that especially Protestant theology put an emphasis on the individual. And once you have that emphasis on the individual, you start thinking in terms of individual rights and individual liberty, things like that. Also, kind of going on with Jonathan Edwards, Edwards is most famous for his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And, this is this vision of eternal damnation where we're like a little insect. We're like a spider that's hanging from a little filament, and, God's holding it over the gaping pits of hell. And it's only by the grace of God that he does not go, yeah, sorry, right? And that's what, that teaching began what's called the First Great Awakening. And that wasn't just limited to the United States, the colonies. It wasn't the United States then. It wasn't limited to the colonies. It actually crossed the ocean, was in the UK, and a very famous preacher, I guess, George Whitefield, picked this up from England and then came back over, and he would preach to thousands of people. And one of his messages was, because the First Great Awakening was this idea that, you need to save your eternal soul from eternal damnation. And the way that happened was only by the grace of God. So it was this awakening experience, right? And what Whitefield was preaching was that you need to make damn sure that whoever your pastor is not leading you astray, because that could lead you to eternal damnation. So it planted this seed. It kind of nourished this idea of challenging authority figures.
Right.
And that has been seen as feeding into the ideas that led to the American Revolution, that it allowed for this idea of challenging authority, right?
Right.
But when the nation was founded, it was founded on secular ideas. It was founded on the old idea of a republic, and it was founded on these ideas of John Locke. And the Lockean idea, in particular, is part of the Enlightenment, which will come up a little bit later when we look into the Dark Enlightenment. But, you know, it's the idea of separation of church and state. You know, the Constitution doesn't specifically use that language, but it is within the First Amendment.
Right.
And it's the idea that, you know, there will be no laws establishing religion. And also it specifically says that there should be no religious test for office. It does specifically say that. And one of the main reasons why you have this separation of church and state and not a national religion is primarily because those Pilgrims and Puritans understood what religious persecution was like.
Right.
And they wanted to have the freedom to worship however they wanted. And you can only have that, ironically, it seems, in a, maybe not ironically, but in a secular government.
Right.
Yeah. So how am I doing with that so far? Is there anything either of you want to add to the history here?
The origins, that's good. I think if we want to talk about Christian nationalism, you know, how does it go from, you know, whether we are a Christian or secular nation to this rise of Christian nationalism?
Yeah.
You know,
well, I think that there's my understanding is, again, part of the history, you know, and it's interesting too. I just kind of want to throw in these statistics because I did research this in the past when I was writing my dissertation. At the time of the American Revolution, I think it was like 17 or 18% of colonists identified with a church.
Wow.
And that number was consistent to the beginning of the Civil War. Now, there is a good reason why that number was so low. And the number was so low because the colonies were a frontier area. You didn't have massive cities yet. It is only after the Civil War and you started seeing these larger cities emerging, you know, like Chicago and St. Louis and various other places, that people were settled. And when people were settled in large cities, then they would be more associated with an actual church.
Right.
But the numbers were always very low until after the Civil War.
And that also ties into the whole individualism too, doesn't it? Because you don't have a church to conform to. You're out there on your own. You're worshiping the way you want to.
Yeah, and you know, as the Americans were moving westward along the frontier, because it was largely Protestant, you had that anyone could interpret the biblical text however they wanted.
Right.
So anyone could be a kind of religious leader. And so you would have people start preaching. And, you know, the big thing was like the tent revivals at the time. And that was the tent revivals helped organize people. It helped organize communities. And when people were on the frontier and they were isolated, it was during these tent revivals that people could actually come together and sort of break that isolation.
So there's an establishment of community through the tent revivals.
Yeah.
And I'd also say that regardless of whether anyone was connected to a specific church, I mean, it was mostly Protestant at the time. But regardless of whether or not they were, they couched so much of what they did in Christian language. It was
Right.
the Western movement and such really epitomized manifest destiny,
Right.
as though there was a God-given Christian right to tally forth and go into the West and conquer those areas.
Right.
If we're looking at an old gold slogan of people that for God, glory, and gold, right? So whether or not we were connected to a church, that Christian ideal certainly spread and was responsible for that Western movement.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the manifest destiny is really crucial to bring up. And that just kind of reminds me of, I know there are going to be things that we forget as we talk about this, but kind of also going back to the Puritans a little bit, this idea that this land was the New Jerusalem. And it's the shining city on the hill. So there's always been something inherently apocalyptic about this nation.
Right.
And the religious movements are the Great Awakening. So you had the first Great Awakening, which was Jonathan Edwards. The second Great Awakening was when along that frontier, what we had just described, with the tent revivals and whatnot. And so, yes, so there was the manifest destiny that, we were supposed to conquer from shore to shore, right? And I also, before kind of moving on, I wanted to note that the founders did see a role for religion. And I think this is important. Many of the founders were deists, so they were not Christian. Benjamin Franklin criticized, I forget which church, I don't remember which church it was, but he said, I'll just say Lutherans. I don't think it was Lutherans, but I'm just using that. But that he said that they seemed more interested in creating more Lutherans than creating good Christians. So it was, he was concerned about that. But the idea was that the churches were supposed to instill virtue into the people. Because virtue is seen as being necessary for the functioning of a republic. And that was the role of religion.
Yeah, didn't Thomas Jefferson basically, he's obviously a deist, but he thought that Christianity provided a good ethics for, the masses.
To some extent, but he also took the New Testament and cut out all the miracles and everything. I think that my understanding is what Jefferson really thought was that not necessarily that virtue would be instilled by going to church, but rather virtue was instilled by working the land. They call it the agrarian virtues, and that sort of self-sufficiency of having a piece of land and working the land would instill all the virtues necessary for self-rule.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't think he was. It's interesting. It's hard to say. When we go back and read the text, he certainly is more interested in Enlightenment philosophers like Locke. He thought that Locke was like the best thinker ever. And he was also with some of the Stoic materialists, was very fond of them, that this is all just matter in motion.
I think it's a good thing to bring up Enlightenment ideals here, because we're about to also go into the antithesis of those, which is the dark Enlightenment ideals of the current system, current. I wouldn't say current administration. Yeah. I don't know if they would own it. I think some of them would, but it's just very antithetical to what we would view as Enlightenment ideals.
Yeah.
Could I go back Could I go back quickly to the agrarian ideals that you were talking
Yeah,
about?
yeah,
We see a kind of a divide between rural and urban mentalities, right? Do you think that ties in somehow that the farmers have inherited this idea that because they work the land, they are somehow, I don't know what I'm saying there.
I
There's
think I
some
know
sort
what.
of,
Yeah, I think I know what you're trying to get at. I don't know that there was such a huge division at the time
okay.
of Jefferson,
Hmm.
and I don't know that working the land created this idea that whoever worked the land was somehow better. Um,
Right.
but that's an interesting question. I don't want to say that it didn't have anything to do with it. It
Right.
very well may, but I think you have to put it into the context of how the urban centers arose
Okay.
in the United States, and they largely arose due to the movement of resources of
Hmm.
wood
Hmm.
and wheat and things like that. So there was always, the farmers would have to go take their goods into the urban centers, into the cities to have them moved about because it became more than just self sufficiency.
Right.
You know,
Right. Okay.
yeah.
It's just a thought I had coming through there. So moving on to we're talking about dark enlightenment. Is that where we're going?
Well, no, I think right now we are just going to look at the Enlightenment because I think
Aha.
it's important to talk about that. Not done with Christian nationalism, but let's talk about the Enlightenment because, and I think this is crucially important, it is very possible, and I've got a book, I don't remember the author's name, called The Enlightenment in America, which makes the case that the United States is an Enlightenment project, and it always
Hmm.
has been. So I'm going to ask Steph to talk about the Enlightenment a little bit, and then
Oh,
Jeremy and I
geez.
can throw in. I'm putting you on the spot. What's the Enlightenment,
Yeah, well,
Steph?
you're gonna get what you pay for here.
Well, I didn't pay
uh,
for anything.
right? Because I haven't prepped myself to talk for this.
Yeah.
So the Enlightenment period starts in the 1700s, right?
Yeah, probably. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is where you have figures coming up, like Immanuel Kant is part of that.
Mm.
Um, uh, John Locke. These are those who it starts out with this idea of that we could build good ethical societies based upon not religious context but reason.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Hmm.
we use reason to develop our laws and uh, to understand our world through science. We get rid of this predominance of the church into our daily lives and into every aspect of it from what we believe to the science of the day. Um, and we start using methodologies instead, like how do we, scientific method. All of these things start to become very important. I guess I should have said 17th century,
Yeah. Yeah.
not
Yeah.
Okay.
hundreds. I apologize.
Yeah.
So here we have the Copernican revolution that
Mm.
really comes out of Kepler and Galileo, and um,
Don't
we
forget
get a lot of
Bruno.
and Bruno,
Yeah.
Giordano Bruno. These ideals which keep us, they free us from the constraints of the church so that we can express ourselves, and it didn't work out too well for Galileo in the beginning. He's imprisoned. um, Giordano Bruno is martyred as one of our first martyrs of free thinking, I would say. He wasn't really a
Hmm.
scientist. um, and that leads to more and more freedom of thought as we go on. So, and at this time we have John Locke, who's basically proposing universal self-evident truths that then get co-opted by the founders of the United States, right? That we're all endowed with inalienable rights, that you can't, you should not trample upon anybody's freedom, whether their freedom to own land, their freedom to, self-determination. That's all Enlightenment thought. So,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's the only thing I would add, and you've already said this, but it's this idea of rights, I think, is what's so crucial there, is because before the Enlightenment, there really wasn't this idea of rights. And it was the idea that we were born with certain rights just by virtue of being human. And, for Locke, you had the big three. You have life, liberty, and property. And so I think we also have to throw in there that this is this is kind of the starting point of personal private property, which really wasn't in existence other than for kings, right? That the kings, there was a commons area that everyone had access to, but really the king and sometimes the queen controlled it all. But this was, you work a piece of land, that land becomes yours. There's a little bit of magic involved, I think.
And before then, I think it's important to state that if you had anything, it was by virtue of what the monarch gave to you, right? Like you were the Duke and Duchess of, I don't know, we'll say Wales, because it's the only thing coming to mind at the moment. But you are given, you are bequeathed this as a steward of those lands that ultimately go back to the monarch, to the realm.
Yeah.
So you can't really, even if you kind of work it, own it, you don't really own it. It's never really yours. It is the king's, the queen's.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Isn't this sort of a secularization of the great chain of being?
What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
Well, oh God, I forget his name right now, but there's this whole idea that God is the ultimate source of everything, and all beings kind of rain down through that. And the closer you are to God, the closer to perfection you are, but God really owns everything. But now it's not God, it's the monarch.
Yeah, I mean that we might go back to the king and the land are one. The idea that divine right of kings, that one is the monarch based upon their favor with the deity, right? And that goes back. That's pre-Christian, and it filters into the Christianity as something that it's kind of always been the thought.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think what's sort of important here, and this is just a little bit of political philosophy lesson maybe, is that what you see coming to the forefront in the Enlightenment, and I also want to note Enlightenment, is, if we look at the etymology again of apocalypse, is inherently apocalyptic. It is this out of darkness, right? It's out of the darkness of the Dark Ages and of the church. But politically, it's this notion of the social contract.
Yeah.
And the two primary, the two things that are always looked at with the social contract is the state of nature and human nature. And, you have, the two major ones from the Enlightenment period are going to be Thomas Hobbes and then John Locke. And these are two very different views of the state of nature and of human nature. And it's because for Hobbes, he was writing right after the 100 Years' War, and he saw a land that had been depleted of its natural resources. So he was like, yeah, there's not enough to go around. It's going to be a constant state of struggle of everyone trying to get enough just to survive. And humans are pretty much selfish and crap. What is it? The life of man is nasty, poor, solitary, brutish, and short.
Yes.
And that he then argued that for his political system, you had to have a monarch to keep us from fighting all the time. The monarch would be the one to kind of divvy things up. But there was nothing within that kind of prevented the monarch from taking more than their own fair share. And then
and he didn't necessarily care about that.
Yeah,
right? As long as you had a very strong leader that centralized everything, centralized the power. And the main book, I think it's worth giving the title of it is Leviathan.
Yeah.
It's like you have this grand, giant, monstrous figure.
Yeah. But, John Locke was kind of the opposite, where the state of nature is a state of plenty. But it's interesting because what was driving that was the North American continent. And they saw this as a land of endless resource, that there would be plenty for probably thousands of generations. And because of that, he also had a better vision of human nature, I think, than Locke definitely did. But it's this notion of a social contract that is central to the American government, because that's what the Constitution is. The Constitution is a social contract. And of course, we got rid of the king. We went more along the lines of Locke. And Locke, it was Virginia. I think Locke is the person who wrote the Constitution for the state of Virginia, or for the colony of Virginia. And we took a lot of that for our own Constitution. So there's definitely a direct connection. And of course, ideas of the ancient ideas of republic, going all the way back to Aristotle at the least. So the Enlightenment gives us this idea of the modern nation state, I think, and individual liberties, individual rights, and I would argue is the social contract, and one that's more predicated on Locke, where the people have a say rather than a monarch.
Right. So it's a more egalitarian construct, right?
Yes. And
so
egalitarianism
each individual has that.
Yeah. Egalitarianism is a really important idea to kind of hold in mind too, for the Enlightenment. And of course, they weren't perfect thinkers, because, not everyone was really equal. If you weren't white or male, sorry, but
well, not just white or male.
Yeah.
You had to own
European.
land.
Yeah.
You had to own land.
Yeah.
And that was a massive part of it.
Yeah. Yeah. But, this is where the American experiment comes from, is the Enlightenment. But let's kind of jump back, because the Enlightenment is all about rationality. It's all about reason. And this was not founded as a Christian nation. There was a role for religion, but the United States became more religious, and this started after the Civil War. It was, but this also corresponds to the emergence of the larger cities. And once you have the larger cities, you can have churches, because people are settled, and that's when they would start identifying with a religion. I always find it really interesting to note, though, that at least in the mid to late 1800s, one of the dominant forms of Christianity was what is referred to as the social gospel. And the social gospel was it came into being as a result of what's often referred to as like the higher criticism that came out of Germany, which was trying to find like authorship of the biblical texts, and was looking at and when people started doing that, they started questioning some of the claims of religion, and they started moving away from any kind of literal interpretation of texts, but rather was focused more on the teachings. And they focused on the social justice teachings of Jesus. Then there's also these ideas, and I know Steph could talk more about this, because this was seen as an attack on religion, and this is where religious fundamentalism comes in. And there's definitely an apocalyptic aspect, and I always confuse these two, but this is pertinent for where we're going in terms of there is this apocalyptic expectation, but you get these notions of premillennialism and postmillennialism. And I always kind of confuse those.
They're very different. I mean, they have a similar root, but they're very different interpretations of them. So basically, what we're talking about with the root millennialism is not like the year 2000 being the new millennium, but rather this 1,000-year reign of Christ that's to come at the end of the current era, or the era of, I guess you could say, humans, to the reign of Christ on earth, which is supposed to last 1,000 years. So premillennialism kind of place the rapture, which is really a 20th century invention, but they place the rapture before the coming, before the tribulation and the coming of Christ, and post millennials place it after. You know that basically post millennials have this belief that we can improve everything. We can perfect humanity. We can perfect the earth, and that is what will bring about the end times. That's what will bring about the return of Christ in that 1,000 years reign. Because what happens is Christ says, Christ, God, whoever you want to put in that place, says, "Oh wow, everything is perfect here. It's exactly how it was envisioned to be. Humanity has risen to the occasion, and now we have this paradise that we will live in." Premillennialism takes the idea that the rapture, the tribulation, come before. That the only people who will be involved in the rapture are those who were good enough, those who have reached, whatever perfection of Christianity is, and they are raptured, and then the rest of us have to deal with the tribulation and every horrible thing that comes with it, because that's our punishment, and we can't do anything to bring about any sort of second coming. We are too faulted as people, and the only being that could bring this is Christ and his return. And then you have the tribulation, the horrible things that occur, and only after everything is purified will Jesus return, and then all's right with the world. A new heaven and a new earth, a new Jerusalem, all that stuff comes afterwards.
Right.
So it's when you hear the terms, they're they get confusing, but they are so very different in their interpretation.
Yeah. I always get confused. The social gospel was trying to create the conditions for Christ's return.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be postmillennial.
Yes.
Okay. Yes.
Stuff
Good.
like the abolitionist movement,
Yes.
would be
Mm-hmm.
postmillennial.
Yeah. And that's the sad part of the social gospel. I like the social gospel, but they did do prohibition. But they also had that focus on
prohibition
helping
was
the
part of
poor.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
And that's it, helping the poor,
yeah.
being good stewards of the earth, all that is
Yeah.
postmillennial.
Yeah.
And premillennials pretty much, there's nothing you could do, so why even try?
Right.
Just be a good person yourself, and you'll be taken care of.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
Very much more individualistic.
Yeah. Well, I like to mention the social gospel movement because it was very influential. It's forgotten. It was sometimes referred to as a Christian socialism. And the main book, I always forget the title, was written by Walter Ruschenbausch. It was the best-selling book for like 3 years in the United States, second only to the Bible itself. And there were ideas within the social gospel that would find their way into Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. And the social gospel was also very influential to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So that's part of the Christian heritage of this nation, but it's one that you never hear about anymore because there's a different idea of Christianity that emerges. And so, kind of sticking with the history, one thing I wanted to point out is that it's really only in the 1950s that you start seeing In God We Trust on our currency. It does appear during the Civil War on coins, but on the paper money, it's only in the 1950s. And it's only in the 1950s that One Nation Under God is included in the Pledge of Allegiance. And there's a reason that all of that happened. And the reason that so much of this happened, this is also the birth of the National Prayer Breakfast, is that when at the end of World War II, so we saw the end of World War II, we saw the end of the Great Depression, America was on the top. And what happened was you had conservative politicians who hated the New Deal. They absolutely detested it. They wanted to get rid of the New Deal. So the question was, well, how are we going to do that? Because Americans liked it. They liked the idea of Social Security. They liked these safety nets. And so what happened was corporate leaders, these were mostly corporate leaders, said, we know how to do this. What we need to do is we need to get the religious base active. And they started focusing on, and they started putting up politicians that would focus on cultural issues. And the very first one was prayer in the public schools. It was prayer in the public schools, and then just prayer in schools in general, segregation, and later abortion. And what they did is they're like, well, if we run politicians who are like, hey, we need to bring prayer back into the schools. Segregation, that should never have happened. And private Christian schools shouldn't be forced to segregate. And abortion, oh my God. So you would get these politicians that would run on those things, but really all they really cared about was dismantling the New Deal. And we saw this come to a head, really, the first time with the election of Ronald Reagan and the formation of the moral majority. But that's where you start seeing this blending of corporate and Christian interests.
And focus through a political lens.
Yeah. And so it's out of this stew that we get this sort of Christian nationalism that is, it's a minority, but it's a very vocal minority. And it's a minority that now has a lot of power in this nation.
And I would also add in there that I think there was a lot of a lot of pressures that built that movement, especially in the 50s. The McCarthyism being a big one, but I think
Yes.
also the idea of we really just started to integrate the idea of nuclear annihilation, right?
Right.
Because we had we had seen what happened in World War II with Hiroshima, and and then we have this Cold War forming at this point with the Soviet Union, and this arms race that begins. And I think it kind of culminates in the 1960s with the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I think a lot of that builds that sort of like apocalyptic idealism starts coming into the forefront that helps build something like a Christian nationalist movement.
Yeah, and it's a very crucial point that you brought up in regards to communism, because that was one of the ideas, is that they are the godless communists. So in order to position ourselves as not that, you have to be a good Christian. You have to be religious. Because you can't be a good Christian and be a communist, right? And so it was, I believe, the numbers in 1980, when Reagan was elected, the number of people who identified as Christian in this nation was 90%.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we saw this massive, this line just kind of going up and up and up from Civil War until the 1980s. And people identifying as Christian. But
I would also say that the Civil War brought upon a lot of people an apocalyptic view of the world.
Yeah,
and that's
definitely.
really where we get that switch over from we can make things better to, no, everything's going to hell in a handbasket. Yeah.
Right. That was kind of our 100-Year War in a way.
Yeah. Well, it's you can see the apocalyptic elements just by thinking about the Battle Hymn of the Republic.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's all in there, right? So you have this kind of this Christian movement beginning, right now we're at the 1980s. And so this has been a 40-year period, 45-year period since 1980. Damn, I'm old. But to where we are now. And I think that we can look at kind of where we are in terms of this sort of the Christian nationalism that we see now. And I think there are some features of it. And I kind of want to get into Trump here too in a moment. But there seems to be this ongoing idea of Christian persecution, because you will hear some Christian leaders saying that Christians are the most persecuted group in the United States or everywhere. Now, I do think it's important to note this is not true in the United States. They may feel persecuted because secularists are like, and that's something we forgot. The other thing that's kind of going along in here is you had the development of Darwin and the further trajectory of science, right? Because there was this backlash against the theory of evolution.
Right.
But you get this idea of persecution. And what I wanted to say is it actually is true that Christians are the most persecuted religious community in the world. But there's a reason for that. Number one is they happen just to be the largest religion in the world.
Yeah.
And so you're just going to get more Christians being persecuted just by numbers. Number two is, okay, who's doing the persecution? And who's doing the persecution? Other Christians.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's key there.
Yeah.
It's not atheist, it's not Buddhist, it's not
Yeah.
Muslims or Jews, it
Right.
is other Christians.
Yeah. 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 I mean, atheists just think, you're full of shit. This doesn't make any sense. Even agnostics are like, yeah, no. But there is this persecution complex that's driving so much of what we're seeing today.
Right.
And there's also this idea, a couple of ideas, is that everything's being presented as a fight between good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
And that this is spiritual warfare.
Yep.
I was watching something on YouTube, and I'm going to try to find his name here, but it was one of the Greg Locke, pastor, Global Vision Bible Church. He actually literally referred to Democrats as demons, as baby butchering demons.
Yep.
You can't enter into any kind of meaningful dialogue with someone who thinks you are inherently evil.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep.
And I think they don't want to enter into a dialogue at all.
No, they
No,
don't.
definitely not.
They don't.
It's set up that way for a reason. I can't listen to anything you say because you're a demon.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's it.
End of conversation.
Yeah. Hail Satan. I'm not a Satanist. I'm just being silly.
Right.
But I think that what is also really important here is that because they view this as spiritual warfare, violence is seen as acceptable.
Right.
Yes.
Especially since the opponents aren't even human.
Right. And I also think that it's very important to note, though, is that so many people think that, well, that's kind of going against Christianity. But all you have to do is look at history, and so much of Christianity is inherently violent.
Mhm.
Just
Oh,
look
yeah.
at the Crusades. Look at what they did
Yeah.
with the pagans and various other people. So there has to be a coming to terms with Christian violence.
Right.
At least the history of it.
It's
Mhm.
very difficult to come to terms with something like that because it's, if I don't do this, if I don't, eradicate these heretics,
Right.
then I risk the souls of billions of other people.
Right.
Yeah.
If you go through the length of human existence, how many people that you're saving in the future
Yeah.
by
Right.
violently getting rid of these people and making an example out of them, which is why you use
Mhm.
so much violence.
Right.
Right.
That will eradicate that, at least, according to their understanding.
Yeah.
Right. The ends justify the means, the greater good,
Yes.
all that stuff.
Right. 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 Absolutely. And there is an apocalyptic element here that they want to
Mhm.
bring about the apocalypse.
Right.
They're tired of waiting for old Jesus. But this is a violent Jesus in many ways. So
Well, it's definitely the Jesus of the Book of Revelation, not the
Yeah.
Jesus of the Gospels.
Right,
He's
right.
presented so very differently. He's riding
Yeah.
a horse, a white horse, and
Mhm.
he's got a sword coming out of his mouth.
Yeah.
He's this is the Jesus of, take no shit, take no
Right.
prisoners.
Right.
Right.
But this is also Old Testament stuff too, isn't it? The
A
wrath of
lot.
God.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah.
So in a way, they're taking the beginning and the end, and kind of forgetting that middle stuff where Jesus says, "Be good to other people."
Yeah. They never pay attention to the Sermon on the Mount.
Right.
That's just that's just hippie talk.
Right.
But yeah, it's very much kind of Old Testament, and that's the thing where you get people, and this boggles my mind, and not everyone, I think, because there are some things here that are important to include. Because yes, there's this idea of we got to go against the idea of abortion, right? Because they'll frame that as baby murder, but yet they are also against feminism and they are
Mm-hmm.
definitely against homosexuality. And you
Right.
have this idea that they make this claim, and we've already kind of mentioned this, that that the laws of the U.S. are based on the Ten Commandments, and they're not. And the thing is there's, I always forget the exact number, but I think it's like 643, 613, 643 laws in the Hebrew Bible, in the Old Testament. And some of the, and that's what this new Christian nationalist movement wants to do, is they want to create biblical laws. And there
Right.
are literally some people that want to see, for example, homosexuals put to death,
Yep.
because that's part of the biblical law from Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
They want women to be subject. They don't want women to vote. They want the man. It's very patriarchal. They want the man to be in charge. They want the man to do the head of the household, to control absolutely everything. They are the vote. They are the voice for the household. And this all gets expressed in Project 2025.
Yes.
Yep. Yep.
And what's really interesting about Project 2025 is that the architects of it aren't necessarily part of the Christian nationalist movement, but they use that to their ends.
Yeah.
Right.
It's they're a very different type of apocalyptic movement, and well, I guess we'll get into that a little bit later. But I think it's fascinating that when you look at them, they are kind of using each other to their own ends, which are neither one of them very, very good for liberty.
Right. Yeah.
Or human beings.
We're human beings for the planet, honestly.
Right. Right.
Yeah. And of course, within this sort of, and I'm not saying this about Project 2025 necessarily, but in this Christian nationalist movement, even though it's misogynistic, it's also very anti-Semitic, because there's fears of the Jews, right? And that they're the ones who killed Jesus. They weren't, but that's what they say. And there's other forms of racism here. And I also think it's important to note that this is not new. The KKK, for example, I think we could refer to as a white supremacist Christian nationalist movement.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's the one we're first introduced to.
Yeah, they weren't burning the cross because they didn't like the cross. That was supposed to represent their passion for Christianity. Fun stuff. So we're going to get into the techno stuff here in a moment, but I think it's really important to kind of talk about Donald Trump and Christian nationalism, because I'm almost speechless with this. But there's this idea that Trump is the chosen one. And that he is, I know that they use the analogy from, again, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, of the Persian ruler Cyrus the Great, that allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. He was a pagan, but he was seen as doing God's work. And so there's this like willful ignorance of not looking at any of Trump's faults, but seeing him as doing God's work.
Right. Bumbling his way in the right direction.
Yeah. I would say that that using him as Cyrus the Great is it works no matter which faction is actually promoting him. Whether we're looking at Christian nationalist or tech bros, both are using him in the same respect as the wrecking ball.
Yeah.
The one who brings about this because he's the only one who seems to be able to get it done.
Right.
For reasons that no one could really figure out, he is seen as this charismatic leader who can come through and make the changes necessary,
right,
to bring about whatever type of society you want. Once he wrecks it,
Right.
which is what
You
he's
can
doing
rebuild
right
it.
now
yeah,
with dismantling the government.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, then you could bring in anyone you want.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and this is part of that Project 2025. Is that the idea is that the entire federal bureaucracy has to be destroyed under presidential control. It's this what is it? The unitary executive theory,
Mhm.
and
Consult.
also it is very clear: no abortions. They want to get rid of gay marriage, and my guess is eventually they want to get rid of gays, and definitely transgender folk.
Mhm.
I don't know what their beef is with that. They also, and I don't understand this, no renewable energy. Um, they want, they think that there's like this war on oil and natural gas. And it's like, for some reason, they have adopted this attitude that climate change is not a reality.
Mhm.
They want to get rid of diversity, equality, and inclusion. And I do think it's very important to keep saying that that's what that is, instead of just saying DEI, to
Mhm.
Right.
actually spell it out. And
Mhm.
they want school choice, because they want to get rid of the Department of Education. So there's really no national standards, and allow for religious schools to teach children stuff that's not true. They want to allow religious indoctrination, essentially.
Mhm.
Do things like teach, 6-day creationism as a valid alternative to the Big Bang Theory or evolution.
Evolution, yeah.
Yeah. Um,
Right.
but yes, within all of this, Trump is seen as the second coming. I was doing research on this. I found someone who wrote a book that Trump is Jesus. He is the second coming of Jesus. And it's like, you can't imagine a more non-Christian person than Donald Trump.
Right.
He's the epitome of like all the vices.
Mhm. It's
He
almost
elects.
cartoonish how.
Yeah.
There seems to be an inability to recognize the more negative aspects of him that bring him closer to an ideal of Antichrist than
Mm-hmm.
Christ himself, right?
Yeah.
It's like you look at him and it's clear to some people that this man is the antithesis of Christ, but
Right.
um, to them, I honestly think if they stick with the idea of Cyrus the Great, they're far more on track
Yeah.
than looking at him in terms of a second coming of Christ, which
Yeah.
is. But I guess if you're looking, it really depends on what your idea of liberation and what that
Well,
is to you.
right. And we've talked about this earlier on, but this whole idea of the monarchy and how the Enlightenment kind of broke that idea apart and created a sea of individuals. In a way, what these people are trying to do is just reestablish a monarchy. They're trying to reestablish the authority figure, a belief in God and one source of power
Yeah.
that's going to rule them all. And Trump fits that. He is
Yeah.
an authoritarian. He is the source of everything he says has to happen.
Hmm.
They're putting in place cabinet members that know that they aren't as smart as him, or people who will bow to his authority.
Well, I think that's
Yeah.
the thing, that they will bow to his authority and do what he wants, not necessarily that they're smart or that he's smarter than
Right,
them.
right,
But
right.
and that's a really crucial point for where we're going to go next. But before we get there, I think one final thing that's important to kind of end this sort of Christian nationalist idea on is January 6th.
Mm.
Because the day before that, there was a mass rally in Washington, D.C., and it was called the Jericho March. And that harkens back again to Old Testament stuff of the Israelites going into the land of Canaan and circling Jericho, and Jericho crumbling down. And so January 6th, there was an apocalyptic idea at the heart of that.
Yeah. Very good point. Definitely, the tearing down of the government, just decimation of it is the goal. And to me, that is the nexus point of where white Christian nationalism and this tech bros aspect kind of converge. Right. It's why they've gotten as far as they have, because it's, you have a lot of tech bros out there, and I'm not trying to be flip about calling them that, but it is very much a male oriented group who've been working behind the scenes at this, and many of them are architects of Project 2025, and it is seen in very much the same apocalyptic narrative that the white Christian nationalists use. And I'm sure there are convergences of some tech bros being white Christian nationalists, but honestly, it's the technocracy aspect of it is, I would say, a model that perfectly fits into MAGA, into white Christian nationalism, because it inherently wants to destroy the government. It is seen as the enemy, the great enemy, and they are following a philosophy that at its core is advocating monarchy, but not even a modern monarchy. It's more advocating a throwback to before, like Charlemagne, before the ideas of constitutional monarchy took place. They want an absolute monarch, and someone like Trump who can come in and just knock everything down and get the job done. And
I don't know that my perspective on this, and my feeling is that Trump doesn't care about any of this.
Oh, no.
Trump just cares about power. So he's just being used by the Christian nationalists. He's being used by the tech bros. He's being used by Putin. And he just doesn't care. He's about revenge and power. But yes, so this, and I feel compelled to put philosophy in quotes here.
Yeah. I spend a lot of time the past few days going into these philosophical concepts of political concepts and quotation philosophy is right, because there seems to be a lot missing from it. There's no real good review of it to criticize it. It's just sort of someone's emoting a bit.
Well, this is and this all kind of goes back to what Jeremy was also saying. So that was a great lead into everything. But I've framed this as the Dark Enlightenment, and the two main thinkers here are, and again, thinkers are Curtis Yarvin and Nick Land, who was a professor of philosophy at the University of Warwick. Now, Curtis Yarvin was writing under a pseudonym of Mencius Moldbug, And that just sounds like someone is siding with Voldemort.
Yeah.
Right. Who's Lord of the Rings too, right? Or was it
Wormtongue
or whoever says
Wormtongue?
Wormtongue. Yep.
And I think actually bringing in Lord of the Rings is a good idea, because the person who is most responsible for backing all of this thought is Peter Thiel.
Right.
Or Thiel.
Yeah.
He's the one who threw his money behind all of this. He's the one who got a lot of people elected based upon this. And he's also the one who has named many of his corporations after things in Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So like Palantir is here. He's got like one named after Mithril, you know. But there's still another one, and I can't think of the name right now, but it's also named after Lord of the Rings stuff. And you sit there and you read this, you watch it, you listen to his thoughts, and you keep going, do you realize that like Palantir was the thing that the evil wizard used?
Yeah.
And it's data analytics software, you know. So a lot of military contracts with that one.
Yeah. Curtis Yarvin actually uses Lord of the Rings symbolism too. And like you, I've just recently started kind of dipping my toe into these waters. I'm not quite emotionally prepared yet to go head first down this rabbit hole. And it's definitely a big old hole. But I know that Yarvin talks about the elves and the hobbits, for example.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he sees, Curtis Yarvin had his start in tech. You know,
he's a software programmer.
He's a software engineer. He's a programmer. And so he was back in the 80s, going to school and doing his thing. But he kind of had this very elitist ideal of you know, who should be able to, you know, sit in court with him. You know, you either were financially well off, or by, you know, just being an awesome IT programmer back in the early days of that. And he really saw he and his folk, his kin, as being like the elves in Lord of the Rings. You know, like the pristine origin of Middle Earth, I guess you could say. And everybody else is more like when the dirty humans came along, you know, and messed everything up. So there's that aspect of it, that there's some purity to certain types of people, and that's what he's grasping at. And I'm like, did you read the whole story? Did you read the whole one? But yeah, no, it is a fascinating origin where they just really love Lord of the Rings.
Right.
Yeah. And it seems like they kind of missed the point of the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. Yeah, they really do. You know, one podcaster I was listening to, his name is Robert Evans, who does the Behind the Bastards podcast, was talking about Curtis Yarvin. And he was the one who proposed he was talking about how Stephen Colbert is a huge fan of Lord of the Rings, and what he would think if like he actually had a conversation with him regarding it. And he's like, yeah, did you miss the point of the of the whole point of the story? Where it is one of those things where you sit there, you think about it, and you cannot make sense of it, because there is no sense to be made of it.
Yeah. But yet it's very influential, and it's influential in California and Silicon Valley. And it seems to me that and I don't know what to call this, but it's a phenomenon that I've seen a few times now, where, you know, because the San Francisco area is considered like more liberal than liberal, right?
Right.
But I have
Right.
seen so many instances of people who are representative of like progressive values switching. It's like they go from far right or far left to far right. My
Hmm.
examples of I think the example that most people are familiar with would be Roseanne Barr. It's a
Yeah.
weird example, but if you look at, like the sitcom back in the day, it had a lot of progressive values. And Roseanne Barr had a lot of progressive things, ideas, and things to say. And this is probably not widely known, but the progressive Pacifica radio station in Los Angeles, she had a radio program for a short while.
Hmm.
Now, it got canceled because her voice is not suited for radio by any stretch of the imagination. But she was in there, and I listened to it for a few times, and it wasn't that her voice was bothersome, but it was clear to me she wasn't thinking, that she wasn't coming from a point of being able to do anything other than repeat talking points in
Mm.
many ways. But then she ends up going from, this like progressive ideology to MAGA, to far right. There's a podcaster that I used to enjoy, Jimmy Dore. He used to be like a big Bernie supporter, and he was always criticizing the Democrats, and the Democrats needed to be criticized. But
Hmm.
then somehow he ended up going to the other side. Um, and it seems to me that something similar is happening in this nursery in the Silicon Valley in San Francisco, San Jose area, of going from very progressive, very liberal to very not progressive, very not liberal.
Um, yeah, and as I was listening to Robert Evans' podcast, uh, where he really explores behind the scenes what's going on in the early 2000s, when we have Mencius Moldbug uh, writing, and he's a very prolific writer,
Right.
right? If you go to his website, which is what is it? It's called Unqualified Reservations,
Yeah.
and you could read everything that he's ever written from 2007 to the current time. Um, there is, he is over time has espoused his philosophical
Mm.
ideas of what government should look like, what or the lack of government should look like, and this had been spread throughout uh, Silicon Valley
Mm.
and through IT people. They would spread his ideas a lot and such, and that's where you get Peter Thiel kind of figuring it out
Mm.
and liking it. Um, and it just started to grow, and it has, like, as you noted, Mencius Moldbug. That's a name that sounds actually rather sinister, right?
Mm.
And that's where this dark enlightenment
Mm.
kind of gets its steam, so it starts to spread amongst those people, and by the time you get to the mid aughts, so you get to around 2014, and right before the next presidential election, you have a whole bastion of people who are behind this. And
Mm.
and while it sounds like, well, really, how did this spread? Why didn't we know about it? Well, it's sort of like a quiet thing they didn't really discuss in open.
Yeah.
Hmm.
It was more like it kind of just comes out more behind the scenes than anything else, but it's spreading.
Yeah.
And it really
Right.
spreads it's really out there in Silicon Valley, and so it doesn't surprise me that you have someone like Roseanne Barr and some other people who have been progressive in their earlier days to now become far more oriented towards this MAGA movement, right? That really comes to the forefront with Trump, and they start putting everything backing Trump because Trump's going to be their wrecking ball.
Right.
He's the one who's going to get it done. That the idea of dismantling government came out in this policy or this idea called RAGE.
Mm.
And it's remove all government employees.
Mm.
Mm.
And they've been talking about this since 2014.
Yeah.
Out in the open.
Yeah. Well,
so even if you don't buy into any of the Christian stuff, you might be buying into these ideas.
Yeah. I'm thinking I should have kept the bottle of rum right next to me. One of the things that I think about here is that, especially like with the progressive ideas and whatnot, is that, and one of Yarvin's points, I think, is that democracy is inherently flawed. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that that's necessarily true. I know that Aristotle, when he was looking at the different forms of government, he looked at the good forms and then he looked at the vicious forms. And he saw democracy as not being a good form of government. And for the reason that Aristotle thought that was because minority groups the focus would be on the minorities. And they would want to try to counterbalance. They would want to claim power from majorities. But he also said that of the corrupt forms of government, democracy is the best, right? But I know that we've all talked over the past 25 years. We've had plenty of criticisms about the United States government. We've had plenty of criticisms about both Republicans and Democrats. And the system is broken in many ways.
Right.
And we've all seen that it needs to be fixed and repaired.
Right.
And I remember, going around, this was in Denver, I think before the 2004 election, in sidewalk chalk, writing, vote for Bush. We've waited long enough for the apocalypse. And it seems to me that that's kind of the idea that's going behind this support of Trump. Is that, we've just waited long enough. Let's just bring someone in instead of to reform things. Let's just break it all down. Let's just destroy
and that's part of
all
his appeal. Yeah, that's part of his appeal as a populist leader, though, too, is that he's tapping into this idea. The system has been broken for a very long time. And everything we're trying to do does not fix it. So let's just tear it. Let's just destroy it.
Yeah. And I mention this because I think it's important to acknowledge the flaws in our system, that it has been a broken system. But at the same time, we don't want to bring it on down and cause so much pain to people who need help. And
yes,
I think they would find that as you're just prolonging the inevitable, making it worse.
Right.
Yeah.
You need to rip the Band-Aid off really fast. Trump's a way to do that.
Yeah.
And but also the idea of basically instilling these what I believe Yarvin would call a CEO king.
Yeah.
We need to knock all this down because none of it works. And if you are protecting people who really are downtrodden and they're poor and they're not the right race, and you're just promoting flawed things that will bring us all down.
Right.
So there is this idea that yes, there's something to be said about peace and being kind and stuff like that. But as it is in government, it's just making things worse. You're
Mm.
bringing everything down to the lowest level possible. And if we want to excel, we're going to have to stop doing that. We're
Yeah.
going to have
Right.
to become strong and cut things that need to be cut and promote things that need to be promoted, and everything else is just going to have to hang because um,
Right.
we're here to promote the best possible world that we can, and that doesn't include you, and you, but maybe you, and you. It's
Right.
Right.
it's it's basically they're deciding who lives and who dies, and I
Mm.
think we can all
Hmm.
basically see what their thoughts are on that, who
Yeah.
should
Right.
live and who should die.
Right. And this is one of the key themes of this dark enlightenment is what's called accelerationism.
Hmm.
And that is inherently apocalyptic.
Hmm.
And it's that, yep, the government's not going to work, so let's just speed it up. And climate change, let's just pump more CO2 in the atmosphere and let's just get it
Okay.
going, which I think is what you were just talking about.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. I, I personally think that with regards to people like Yarvin and Teal, I think it's known, absolutely known, that climate change is a real thing,
Hmm.
that it's
Right.
happening, and I think that's why we're seeing these bizarre sort of statements of, Canada should be the 51st state, that we should go for Greenland,
Hmm.
that we need the Panama Canal. I think it's because, honestly, they absolutely know what's happening.
Yeah.
Right.
And they're trying to get all the resources that they can while they can.
Right.
Um, we can look at Putin and what's going on in Russia and say that's, their land grab there. And then we can look at Xi Jinping and say what's going on with him in Taiwan and Southeast Asia. That there is this massive land grab going
Right.
on that says
Right.
to me, yeah, we actually know climate change is real. We're trying to get everything that we can to secure our stuff. And you look at Tech Bros and all of these resources, if we're looking at the resources that they were trying to make an arrangement with for Ukraine, um, and then what
Yeah.
the resources available in Greenland and in Canada, that's very much stuff that we're going to need to build our AI infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Because
Right.
those are all important stuff
Right.
to them. Yeah, so it's to me it's no big surprise.
Yeah.
I mean, initially it is, but then you realize what they're doing, and it's like, oh, okay, that's what they're
Yeah.
doing, to the detriment of anyone who stands in their way.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I also want to point out, this term dark enlightenment. One is that the dark enlightenment is a contradiction of terms,
Yeah, well,
right? But it is definitely against the notion of democracy, of
Right.
human rights. It goes against ideas of egalitarianism and multiculturalism. All of that is rejected.
Hmm.
yeah, it's this idea that it basically plays into, in my thought, Thomas Hobbes' idea
Mm-hmm.
of humanity
Yep.
is that we are
Yep.
inherently nasty people. We are
Right.
nasty things.
Right.
And what the Dark Enlightenment does is it leans into what it believes is actual human nature and
Mm-hmm.
says, you know what, we should be acting in accordance to our nature.
Yeah.
And our nature is not great. Our
Yeah.
nature is pretty
Hmm.
nasty.
Yeah.
So yeah, lean into that because that's what's going to get us through all this.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to note that when we think in terms of the Enlightenment, the very idea of enlightenment, it is also associated. Another way of saying this is awakening,
Hmm.
and the Dark Enlightenment is anti-woke.
Right.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
woke is this idea of being awake, right? It's this idea of social
Mhm.
justice. It's the idea of diversity and equality. things that the Enlightenment endorsed. And it's no surprise now that there's this anti-wokeness aspect to all of this.
Right.
And I think also like co-opting terms like enlightenment and putting dark in front of it. A lot of the things that they're doing, the use of symbols, really big. Like the use of Lord of the Rings stuff.
Right.
It's also invoking this sort of mysticism.
Yeah.
That makes it appealing to certain types of people.
Right.
They're very aware of what that is. I don't think you use the name mentions Moldbug with anything other than to appear mysterious and Voldemorty and stuff like that. But I think that's an important part that needs to be illuminated. The fact that they use terms to specifically make it look like they are some sort of technomancers,
Right.
Yeah.
Like they're seeing a reality that we cannot.
Yeah.
Well, creating one.
Yeah.
Yes.
They're through programming. I think it was Robert Anton Wilson who says, "Don't fear that the computers are going to take over. Fear the programmers."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones who are trying to create this new reality in their vision.
Right. Which is my big fear of AI, actually, is that AI just collates data, right? That's really what it does, and spits out a general idea of what it's found. But who is providing it the original data?
Yeah, and it's a very Wizard of Ozzy type of thing too, where you have this, don't look behind the curtain. There's a mechanism. It's like, you could put this big Oz figure up front who is scary and we all fall in awe of it, like, the Great Leviathan. But behind it, they're just a bunch of programmers,
Right.
And they very much are enamored with their idea of creating God in their image. That's all part of it. And I think that's also why you can get this overlap between them and MAGA and with them and white nationalism, because it feeds into hierarchies, it feeds into religious themes. It works.
Yeah, it seems to me that MAGA is kind of being used. I mean, in the sense that I can understand in 2016, I could understand why Trump won, because things were so bad that he was just a Molotov cocktail, and I say that specifically into the halls of power, right? And I get that. I mean, I was disgusted by him, but I understood.
Right.
But now, it just seems like MAGA is just being used by these two other forces. Yes. And, you just quoted Robert Anton Wilson. Something else that he said that I think that people ought to do on a regular basis is he said, every day you should ask yourself, am I being a useful idiot for someone?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's really key, because one thing that I have found is that, Trump, Elon Musk, any Teal, you could say, anyone in that group, Vance, they actively hate people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They actively hate humanity. We are very troublesome in their grand scheme of what they want to do.
Yeah.
And Teal and Vance and such, they might have other ideas regarding, Trump. But I think they're on the same page in terms of, let's use these useful idiots.
Yeah.
Right.
Trump, you're right. He's got no idea what is actually being done.
Right.
He is
Right.
happy to stay out of jail and have some power to be nasty.
Yeah.
Hmm.
But
Wait,
you can't convince me that this man likes anybody.
yeah,
You
he's a
know,
useful
Right.
idiot. I mean, he's a useful
he is.
idiot to the Christian nationalists. He's a useful idiot to these tech bros, and he's a useful idiot to Putin.
Hmm.
Yes. Oh,
Yep.
definitely. You know, and
Yeah.
that's the other force in hand, right?
Yeah.
Putin represents this other side. And what's going to be interesting if it ever gets to that point is what happens when they get what they want. They've knocked everything down, and now they have to contend with each other
Yeah.
Right.
because
Yeah.
they are not the same.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's what's gonna end up being is that they're just gonna eat each other alive, and we'll see who comes out on top. I do think it's important to note one that hasn't been explicitly stated, but Peter Thiel supported J.D. Vance, provided a lot of money
Yes.
for him to become a senator. So there's your
Hmm.
connection there. And we haven't actually talked too much about Elon Musk, and I don't know
Right.
how much he is cognizant of this sort of dark enlightenment. My guess is he is, especially since he likes to come out as dark MAGA.
Right.
Yeah. Well, he and Peter Thiel
Thiel, yeah,
started. They
right,
started PayPal together, so
yeah,
they definitely know each other well, and I don't think that's any
yeah,
mistake. That I think if you ever listen to Peter Thiel speak, he's not very outgoing. You
yeah,
know, he's all right. I mean, but he sounds like any businessman that
mm,
you've ever had to listen to at work. You know, uh, but Elon Musk represents a much more, I don't know if I'd call it charismatic, but
Well.
it's much more visual and jumping about
Hmm.
and making a big
yeah,
scene. It's very theatrical.
mm,
And
Right.
so he's a much better person to put out front. He also has much
Right.
more money, but you can't tell me that the person who's actually putting this all together isn't Teal. You know,
right,
Right.
it's he's obviously the one who has more intelligence, more he's got more of the architect behind it, based
Right.
on the writings and ideology of Curtis Yarvin.
yeah,
So,
Right.
and Yarvin himself, if you ever listen to him speak, is also not very charismatic. He's very kind of, it's hard to listen to him,
yeah,
honestly.
Hmm.
yeah,
Um, but he's on a whole bunch of podcasts. If anyone out wants to actually go out there and see what he's all about yourselves, you can go to his website. You can listen to him on podcasts. They are out in the open. I want to make that clear. This is not conspiracy theory.
right,
They are so far out in the open, but I don't think that they're really taken very seriously.
yeah,
Um,
Right.
but all of this stuff, it's all written out there. The fact that they are for monarchies, the fact that they are for completely dismantling government, every little bit of that is out in the open. And you could read
Right.
about it or watch it.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that's an important point. This is not conspiracy. This
No, no.
is out there in the open. Um,
Hmm.
and you know the other aspect to this sort of dark enlightenment, because especially this notion of accelerationism, it's not just to the right. There's also a left to it.
Hmm.
And there's even my favorite that I just stumbled upon yesterday was Kali Ak, which is the accelerationism connected to the Kali Yuga. so, yeah, we haven't talked about the Kali Yuga too much, but you know, this is all kind of finding its voice in what's referred to as the alt-right.
Hmm.
And you have, you know, with the alt-right, that's also kind of difficult to define often. But you get this blending of white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and neo-fascists, all kind of coming
Hmm.
together as well, which is to go against these ideas within the Enlightenment of
Hmm.
Right.
personal rights and personal liberty. Um,
No, and they abhor personal rights and
oh
personal
yeah,
liberty because
yeah,
it's to them it's very much something that gets in the way of progress. It gets in the way of actually getting anything done. It celebrates human folly over human achievement. By elevating those who, in their eyes, should not be elevated.
Yeah.
Right.
So we've got this confluence of these different things coming together, and the United States right now is a fucked up place to be. What do you see? I'm just curious because I know we've kind of gone over our normal time, but I'm kind of curious what you both think. What do you think is the likely outcome to where we are right now?
Oh my gosh. Violence. I don't think there's any way that this gets solved without violence.
I agree with that.
And they would like that. Because they are very connected to this idea that violence is what is needed to turn things about. And that's also something that you can read about, watch. They're into that. I think that it is a likely outcome. I also think that it will fail ultimately because it's too heavy. It's going to fall under its own weight. But not before it doesn't completely wreck everything. A lot of people will be hurt in the process, but I think that it can't stand because the majority of people outweigh. I mean, I don't think you can use MAGA the way they're using MAGA and think that that's not going to create a very unstable platform for them. That's their bread and butter, and they've already shot them in the face. Not everyone has realized it yet, but they will very soon understand that they've just been they've been dupes for this. And when that happens, I think it will just be crushed under its own weight. And we don't see fascist movements lasting very long.
No.
Long enough to really wreck things, but I think hopefully maybe we can create something new on the other side, something better.
Right. And there's the old saying, evil always eats itself.
Yeah. I agree with that.
Yeah, I hope so. But it's, in terms of accelerationism, I want this to be over with quick. But I don't know that it will be over with quick. I think there's a lot of, I don't think that the opposition has really shown its face. I don't think that the Democratic Party is a true opposition. I mean, you had one person, like shaking their cane, which is awesome, but everyone else is just holding up like little paddles. And I'm like, what the actual fuck? That's not going to stop anything.
I do believe that the opposition will come outside of the government. It will not be part of the government because right now they're trying to survive. They're trying to survive something that, in my opinion, no longer exists. And they are still trying to maintain some sort of status quo that has been completely demolished. And they need to wake up to the fact that the rules are not the same.
And they haven't been for at least 20 years.
No, and at this point, we have literally the dismantling. We don't know if, I think by Monday we'll know if Trump's going to pay the $2 billion out in the USAID money that they've been commanded to pay by the courts, by the Supreme Court. If he doesn't do that, then I don't think that we're in a constitutional crisis. I think that it has occurred.
It's past.
And they need to wake up to the fact that it is not, or maybe they have, and that's why they're being so docile.
I don't know. It's, I agree with all of that, and I always saw that the major turning point here is going to be when he defies the courts.
Right.
And there are too many people, I think, who are still confident that the court rulings are going to save us. And I think
Mm-hmm.
going through the courts is just often way too slow of a process. And then it doesn't also acknowledge the fact that he could just say, fuck you, court.
Yeah,
Right.
and who's one of his favorite presidents ever? It's Andrew Jackson, right? Who famously basically said, Justice Marshall has had his say. Now let's see him enact it. Regarding what turned into the Trail of Tears, right?
Right.
The Indian
Mm-hmm.
Removal Act, and so we if he defies the court, and likely he will, even if he doesn't do it just now, what are you going to do to stop him?
Right.
So
That's a whole other question, I think, in terms of
Right.
what needs to happen in terms of resistance. Because I think the resistance right now is weak. I don't think that you can have just a 2-hour protest in the middle of the week at noon, and it's not going to work. There has to
Right.
be sustained pressure, and I'm glad that there's like boycotts and whatnot happening right now, but it needs to go even further.
Yeah, I mean, like right now there is the Amazon boycott going on from the 7th until the end of the month, and that's a bit better because it's taking much longer period of time. But I think also that if people are engaged in that boycott for that amount of time, that also in that time start researching alternatives that you can
Right.
regularly go to instead of going to Amazon, instead of going to these companies that support this takeover, this coup.
Yeah, and that's what it's been. It's been a coup, and I kind of agree with you. I think that I just keep saying, the Republic has fallen, and I think that we need to recognize that and move forward.
Well, they are recognizing it, right?
Yeah.
They are very much recognizing it. I mean, the Teal had written a piece in January. Let me see if I can bring it up. A time for truth and reconciliation. Trump's return to the White House augurs the apocalypse of the ancient regime's secrets. That's how he wrote it. And yeah, this is basically lauding the death of democracy.
Yeah.
And because they find democracy antithetical to freedom.
Yeah.
Because it is the tyranny of the majority.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That's what we're up against.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be an interesting several years, I think, on another many levels. So we've run over quite a bit. Do either of you have any final thoughts on any of this?
No.
Yeah. Well, Jeremy,
Fight
you're
the
safe.
system.
You're in Japan.
Keep fighting the good fight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Notice my shirt. I aim to misbehave.
There you go.
Nice.
Unfortunately, I haven't been able to go to any of the protests because they've all been at times where I've had other things, other work scheduled. And I'm like, do it on a weekend where more people can go. Don't do it on a Wednesday at noon. This is
I think
silly.
a Wednesday can potentially be more disruptive, though.
It could be, but most people are like, I can't take off of work. Gotta be at work.
Well, civil disobedience is kind of like, yeah, I understand that, but if you're going to be disobedient and disruptive, you go on.
Oh, we haven't seen any civil disobedience yet. There is a national day of strike called though. I think is it the end of this month?
I think so. Let me look that up.
Yeah, because my concern with like boycotts of Amazon, and I know that Tesla is tanking in Europe, is that Musk and Bezos are just so freaking rich that it means nothing to them. It may mean that they have to cut workers or whatnot, but they just don't care.
All right, let me. I'm not finding it very quickly.
Yeah, that's
okay. I do believe it was at the end of the month.
Yeah, I think so as well. I'll see if I can find a post for it and put it in the show notes or the video description for this episode. So, keep the fight going. It needs to get much bigger,
right.
much bigger. But thank you again, both of you, Jeremy and Stephanie. Yeah. It's always a pleasure to meet with you and have these conversations.
Yes.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Nick.
Yeah. So, all right. Keep fighting the good fight.
Yeah. See y'all next time.
Yeah.